And I think it's fair to point out that it was not your only interest as a kid. I know you as you're a sports fan. Obviously,
Sure.
You're very interested in your kids. You have a wife and family, so you're not living in a cave, obviously.
No, yeah, right.
And so let's go to Nostra Aetate itself.
Yeah.
When did you first become aware of it? The Declaration.
Yeah. Well, when I was young, I was in 1965. I was 11 when it was published or promulgated, as they say, in October of 1965. I was involved in the church at that time. I knew things were going on in Rome. I knew about the Second Vatican Council, and I began to know about the details of that. So it was pretty early, but the real details about Nostra Aetate didn't become evident to me until after I began to get interested in Judaism as being more a part of my life. And I began to read the writings of many people, but one of them, and probably the most influential, was a fellow by the name of Eugene J. Fisher. Dr. Fisher was the Associate Secretary of the United States Catholic Conference of Bishops. And he was, and I think it's fair to say, that he's the most prominent Catholic lay person in the United States in the past 50 years on the field of interfaith relations. And so I began to read Dr. Fisher's work in the many books that he's done. And it was there I began to learn in much more detail what Nostra Aetate was all about.
And so let's talk about that. I mean, who first had the idea of taking the notion of better and friendlier relations between Catholics and Jews and formalizing it in this declaration?
Yeah. Well, I'm glad you asked I'm glad you asked the question, because that's what the book says. That's exactly what the book does. It tells that story of where it emerged, from where did it emerge, and it's a long story, as you might imagine. In the book, I condense it down to 122 pages, but it covers 2,000 years of history, and the short version of it is that the church was involved in almost 2,000 years of a very negative relationship with the Jewish people. And after the Second World War, and in the aftermath of the Holocaust, the founding of the State of Israel, and all the changes that began to happen in the world, it was a great sort of yearning, I think, by the world community to do something about these terrible things that had happened during the Second World War. And at that time, in the early 60s, late 50s, early 60s, the new Pope, Pope John XXIII, called the church to a council. The second time, the First Vatican Council was in the 1800s. This is the Second Vatican Council. And his whole idea was to, as he said, aggiornamento in the Italian, to update the church. And while that was going on, he began to put together many pieces. And one of the pieces that he put together was to meet with a French philosopher by the name of Jules Isaac, someone who he had learned about and met during his years during and after the Second World War. And Jules Isaac was very prominent in developing the notion that Christianity had very deep roots and being involved in anti-Semitism. So Pope John, in meeting with Jules Isaac, began to understand that better. And so he called together prominent Catholics and quite a few Jews as well to say, we want to deal with this problem of our relationship with the Jewish people throughout the years. So we want to put that into the changes that we're going to make, the aggiornamento that's going to happen as a result of the Second Vatican Council. So it got into the council, many people began to work on it, and in 1965, as the last document of the council, there were many documents, as the last document of the council, this document came out.
Is it coincidence that this happened at the cusp of the whole make love not war, flower power, peace and love era? Is it just coincidence?
Of course not. Of course not. It's and as I tell the story around in many places, people are surprised, I think, when I folded into the many changes and the freedom movements that were going on around the world at exactly the same time. In fact, what I say is that Nostra Aetate was one of the major civil rights accomplishments of the 20th century. And so that's the way that I frame it. And it is very much a child of the times.
And it's interesting that Pope John was very moved to make changes to the church. And as we're approaching the 50th anniversary, we have Pope Francis, who
Right.
was probably as big a shaker and a maker and shaker and mover of
Right.
things in the church as there may have been since then. I mean, John Paul gets a lot of credit for being well liked, but he didn't
Right.
make the kind of social and religious changes that Pope Francis is pushing. Is there a parallel between the two?
Between
Pope John,
Pope Francis,
and Francis.
Well, you know more about this topic than you're admitting, because many people make that comparison with Pope Francis as being very fatherly and pastoral in his approach, which does really harken back, if you think of the popes between Pope Francis and back to John the 23rd. The popes in between had many types of personalities, but these were the two that were really kind of fatherly, and they'd put their arms around you, and they'd want to make you feel good and that kind of thing. So yeah, there are many things that they share. Absolutely.
And it's very different going, of course, from John Paul II to Benedict to Francis. Benedict, if the church, I think, had gone from John Paul II right to Francis,
right,
there's sort of a continuity there of a human touch. But Benedict, in the middle of him, sometimes felt like the very harsh middle-aged, not middle-aged, but Middle Ages kind of religious figure.
Yeah, that's right. I think you're right. Yeah, you're right. And
yeah, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say that, yeah, that was, and that's why it's important to think in terms of the different personalities of the people who held that job. John Paul II was an extremely important pope in terms of Catholic-Jewish relations, too. Okay. And in truth, when he died, the Jewish community around the world mourned, along with the Catholic community, because there was a great affinity between the Jewish people and John Paul II, which went back to his childhood in Poland. But yeah, I think that's right. In a sense, Pope Benedict kind of created a bridge, I think, and in our minds allowed us to make that transition from the extremely long pontificate of John Paul II to this new type of pontificate, which harkens back to John the 23rd, but it's new in our lifetimes, new in our generation to see a pope like this. Maybe it's new from forever, really.